Hi-Fi Rush is Tango Studios' hit rhythm-based game that feels like a cross between Devil May Cry and Guitar Hero. The whole world moves to the beat as you smash your way through the Vandelay Technologies campus to uncover the mystery behind the top-secret Spectra program. In today's challenge, I'll be taking you through my journey with Chai and friends in Rhythm Master difficulty. This is considered the highest difficulty mode in the game and requires you to maintain a C score or higher. If your score drops to a D, then you get an instant game over. Now, even though this sounds easy, each combat sequence, or chorus, starts off with a half-filled C meter and drops incredibly quickly. This can make even the most simple fights nearly impossible in the wrong circumstances. In regards to rules or parameters, there's truly only one goal, and that's to beat the game on Rhythm Master difficulty and obtain an achievement that less than 1% of the player base has obtained at the time of the video. Follow me on my journey to get one of the rarest achievements in Hi-Fi Rush. All of the footage was captured on or before February 20th, 2023. Before I began this challenge, I had no clue what to expect. I was terrified that the Rhythm Master difficulty would require you to execute all moves on the beat or result in an instant death, like some other games. But fortunately, only the combat sequences require you to maintain the C or higher grade. This allows for low-stress platforming sequences and freedom to explore to your heart's desire. After playing through all of the endgame challenges and getting the secret ending on my casual playthrough, I had become a rhythm monster, so the first few choruses went smoothly, and I was confident that the only difficult sections would be the numerous boss fights. But oh, was I mistaken. Due to the fact that you start off with a half-filled C meter, taking as little as one hit can result in a game over. I learned this the hard way after getting through some of the introductory battles. But before long, I had grown accustomed to the speed at which the score decreased and was able to maintain S ranks in most situations. I even avoided using partners before they would have been unlocked in the story to focus on honing my melee combos. I finally made it to the first boss, QA Mill, and just as I suspected, this is where the Rhythm Master difficulty really shined. Just like any other battle, Chai starts off with a quickly depleting meter that allows no room for errors. Each sequence or phase must be executed perfectly if you want to survive the first seconds of any boss fight. The first phase taught me a few things. I realized that even doing combos without actually hitting an enemy could help maintain the meter, and most important of all was the fact that each new phase started off with a checkpoint. The checkpoints were truly a double-edged sword, however. The good thing was that you wouldn't have to start a boss fight over from scratch, but if you died, your meter would start off back at a half-filled C rank, making the starting seconds of the new phase even more difficult. With each new phase, the QA bot kept adding new moves to his repertoire, so perfectly timed parries and staying aggressive were key to dwindling his health bar down to 0. As he entered his final phase, I knew that although this fight would certainly end in his defeat, the bosses ahead would be much less forgiving. I trudged on towards Rekka's department and prepared for the worst. Rekka was the first true boss fight, and considering the fact that she had several attacks that made her impervious to damage, I was a bit worried. The fight started off excellent. I did my best to stay on the offensive and parried every chance I could. Rekka had this move where she would cover either herself or the floor in electricity, and this wasted quite a bit of time. I had to consistently perform air combos just to maintain the meter until the effect wore off. Once it did, I was able to return to my aggressive attack style and take down her health one chunk at a time. I was pleasantly surprised by how quickly I progressed the fight and kept applying the pressure until she was defeated. With 2 bosses down, I was confident that this challenge run would be a breeze. The next boss, Zanzo, didn't actually have a standard boss fight. Instead, he would use the resources from his R&D department to create VR simulations and a series of challenges throughout the level. As per usual, most of the courses didn't pose any issue at all, until I got to this section here. This course threw wave after wave of enemies that seemed to never end, and what made it worse was that the enemy types synergized so well. This made it incredibly difficult to get my rhythm down, and I definitely paid the price. After countless deaths, I realized that some courses were much more difficult than boss fights because of the fact that health was so scarce, and checkpoints were few and far between. Not only that, but at this point in the game, new enemies were introduced that required a perfect execution to defeat them. If you missed any inputs, you would have to start the QuickTime event sequence again and risk having to restart the entire chorus. With great effort, I finally beat the chorus and moved on through Zanzo's department. It wasn't long before I got my gift basket and depleted Zanzo's budget, defunding him in the process. Up next was Corsica, the head of security and latest addition to the Vandelay Technologies management team. The path to her office was convoluted, and the samurai enemies proved to be a real challenge. In my original playthrough, I never really figured out an effective way to defeat them. Instead, I just spammed partner abilities and mashed away like a madman, and more often than not, it actually worked. In Rhythm Master difficulty, these enemies were a serious threat and could end a good run in seconds. Fortunately, I learned the timing of their attacks and relied heavily on the sequence break that was made possible due to the fact that I had already beaten the game. Normally, by this time, you do not have access to Corsica yet, but her ability to stun enemies and interrupt their attacks was invaluable for this area. After a few attempts, I learned that my usual strategy of staying on the offensive and playing aggressively paid off, especially with the help of Corsica. But the most difficult part proved to be mastering the timing for the QuickTime event sequence. Every powerful enemy has a unique QTE sequence and timing that must be input perfectly in order to get a chance to defeat them. If you fail, you take damage and risk starting the entire fight sequence all over again. The samurai robot has one of the most difficult timings to master, surpassed only by a few enemies that we will encounter later in the game. After the samurai was defeated, I activated the remaining nodes and snuck my way into Corsica's office. Fortunately, the fight with Corsica was not a traditional boss fight. It's more like an advanced tutorial on the QTE sequences that end most encounters with powerful enemies or bosses later in the game. Oh yeah, and one thing I forgot to mention is that I was streaming this game from the Game Pass, and it's my understanding that it uses a cloud-based system. Throughout the challenge run and even my casual playthrough, I experienced the occasional input lag, missed inputs, and connectivity issues. This was a very common occurrence and would often force me to quit out of the game to try and secure a better connection. This ended up being a serious problem for me during the QTE sequences because the timing would be off just by a fragment of a second each time. Before long, Corsica went down and we took a trip underground. The monorail section was a lot of fun. It definitely forced me to manage my health, destroy the brake pads, and maintain my score to avoid an instant death all at once. The key was to manage Macaron's cooldown and find ways to multitask while waiting for it to recharge. After narrowly avoiding death and saving Corsica, Chai and friends joined forces and headed towards the head of the marketing department, Mimosa. This new track introduced fire enemies that cause an incredibly annoying burn status effect that interrupts your attacks, prevents you from using partner combos, and deals insane amounts of damage over time. Corsica is the best counter for these enemies, but they can still be a huge problem when Chai gets surrounded. The level was simple aside from the occasional bird robots, which have one of the most difficult QTE sequences, but it wasn't until I made it to the chorus with the electrified floors that the difficulty really spiked again. This course had the worst possible enemies, from flaming sword robots to the boxer. This initial wave was painful. Not only that, but I stubbornly refused to keep an eye on the floor and got electrocuted constantly. The second wave introduced an aggressive, fast-moving enemy that relied on razor-sharp attacks to deal damage quickly. After 1 hour of attempts, I finally got to the third phase consistently and died instantly. The final wave had one of those annoying bird robots and some wannabe Mega Man guys that had flamethrowers, so I used my special attacks to soften them up so I could focus on the biggest bird. But none of the inputs registered, so I wasted a nice chunk of my reverb gauge and didn't deal any damage in return. I stayed airborne as much as possible and got a second chance to use my special attack, which triggered the QTE sequence for the bird, which happens to be the longest in the entire game. I missed the first attempt, but had just enough life to try again and pulled it off. I took out the remaining enemies and headed towards Mimosa. Still didn't get it right. Finally. I had been dreading this fight the entire challenge because I remembered a specific attack that traps Chai in a field of lasers and is really difficult to dodge. Lucky for me, the first phase was a breeze, and I was able to get to the next stage in the battle. I stayed aggressive and nearly had her on my first try, but I failed and had to start the second phase over. I was surprised that my non-stop attacks had actually prevented her from initiating the attack I was worried about, but she suddenly gained sentience and remembered the laser attack and spammed it like crazy. It wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it would be though, so after a few practice runs, I was able to get her to the next phase. The third phase proved to be the hardest because she would use this disco ball to shoot out lasers that were nearly impossible to deflect. When I reached the scripted QTE sequence, I tried my best to get the timing down, but I just couldn't pull it off, and I was forced to start the entire third phase over again. After a few more attempts, I reached the QTE sequence again and failed miserably. I only had enough health to take one hit, before I was sent back to the game over screen, but then this happened. We're gonna die again. Oh my gosh. Mimosa was able to achieve her dream of becoming a star, quite literally, and we made our way to the rooftops. Chai had a brilliant plan to launch himself from a cannon, so naturally the team found a way to make it happen. We landed in the cafe, defeated some robots, and reached Rogue for its office. Initially I was terrified and I remembered how I got mauled in my casual playthrough. But after making this much progress in Rhythm Master Mode, I hadn't realized how much of a beast I'd become, no pun intended. I managed to nearly pull off beating all phases of the boss fight without taking hardly any damage at all. This was a huge win and a big time saver. This allowed me to take on Kale and all of his transformations while I was still fresh. However, I was reacquainted with an age-old enemy, connectivity issues. The cloud-based streaming service failed nearly 20 times in this final stretch of my stream, and it caused me to die dozens of times. Cinnamon used a Kamehameha to destroy Kale's robot, and 808 scratched off Kale's Spectra plate. Now it was time for the final battle. I was so close to unlocking the achievement I could taste it. But Kale's drones and Microsoft's cloud-based streaming proved to be a nearly unstoppable combo. It didn't take me long to nail down the timing for Kale's melee strikes, but the drones were impossible to deflect without headphones on. I couldn't rely on the visual cues, and the lack of available health made each phase incredibly challenging. Not only that, but Kale's boss fight was the only one that was so heavily reliant on RNG. If he spammed the drones, there was no way I could do enough damage to outpace him. For most of the playthrough, I had relied heavily on Macaron's sheer power and DPS, but after multiple failed attempts, I changed things up and used Peppermint as the primary damage dealer in my lineup. This proved incredibly effective, and even without all of her chip upgrades, her damage output was huge. This made such an impact that I was able to breeze through the last phase after adopting the new strategy, and just like that, my journey came to a stylish end. After I watched the epic finale, I discovered that I was one of the first people in the world to obtain this incredibly rare achievement. With only a 0.04% unlock rate, less than half of 1% of the player base was able to bask in the ambience of pure awesomeness. Will you be going for one of Hi-Fi Rush's most difficult achievements? Let me know down in the comments below. And that's all for this video. If you enjoyed it, please be sure to subscribe. I do challenges like this on Twitch weekly, but have planned to move the full operation over to YouTube. Let me know your thoughts on that as well. And until next time, it's the Inhuman One signing out. Consider becoming a patron for exclusive behind-the-scenes content. Join the Inhuman community today.